Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this John P. Berkelen lecture, Trump and the Great Electoral Crisis of 2020, with Professor Lawrence Douglas, who is this spring's John Berkelen Fellow at the American Academy. John Berkelen was a trustee of the American Academy and a great figure in our earlier history. He, as some of you may know, was the CEO of the investment firm Dillon Read. He was himself also something of a historian, wrote a biography of Gustav Stresemann, and he endowed this fellowship for the purpose of fostering German and American dialogue in the humanities. We've had over a dozen outstanding historians, philosophers, and literary scholars at the Academy since that time as John P. Berkelen Fellows. Most recently, Brazilian historian James Green had this fellowship. Literature scholar Martin Puchner of Harvard was also a John Berkelen Fellow, as was the distinguished historian Omer Bartov. Tonight's speaker, Lawrence Douglas, currently serves as the James Grossfeld Professor of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought at Amherst College, and he too is our Berkelen Fellow. Unfortunately, he is not actually at the Academy right now because of the pandemic. He will be joining us in person in Berlin at a later date, and we're very much looking forward to that. But he has agreed to give this presentation so that we might include it in the spring program with his other cohort of fellows, with the other members of his class. And I'm very grateful for that. I will not have the honor of introducing Lawrence Douglas, but I do want to introduce the man who will have that privilege. Peter Carstens is a correspondent for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. He covers defense issues and security, and also the Social Democratic Party. His academic background is in history, political science, and philosophy. And he joined the FAZ, as we call it, in 1994, and has worked in a number of different sections of that great newspaper. It's my understanding that Peter Carstens and Lawrence go way back, more than a decade, when Peter helped arrange the publication of an essay by Lawrence in the FAZ about John Demjanjuk, famous war criminal, and that the research that went into that original article later blossomed into Lawrence's 2016 book, The Right Wrong Man. So Peter has been instrumental in Lawrence's research and bringing him to a broader audience in German. So I want to thank you for that. Before I turn it over to Peter, I just want to explain the roadmap for tonight. Lawrence and Peter will speak for 10 or 15 minutes. And then you can start sending in those questions just as soon as you would like. And Peter will present them to Lawrence as part of the conversation. They will probably chat for a while, but feel free to start sending in the questions. Just make sure you send them in through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. If you have a chat function or a hand raise function, don't touch it. No one will see it. Only those questions that go into the Q&A column will be scanned. So with that, let me thank you again, Lawrence, for joining us. Thank you, Peter, for taking this on. And I turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Tonight's guest is Professor Lawrence Douglas, and it's a pleasure to see you, Lawrence, even though behind the iron curtain of COVID still. Recently, I read a book about polymath, giants of universal knowledge, written by Peter Burke. And I couldn't stop thinking of Lawrence Douglas while reading that. Although, to my surprise, Burke didn't even mention Lawrence. He fits perfectly into the schemes of universal scientists who are not bound to their faculty or any special field of interest. Lawrence studied law at Yale after attending Brown College shortly after he was born in New York. Now he teaches law at Amherst College. But besides New England, his second home is Berlin. And besides law, he is interested in nearly everything. Professor Douglas wrote about a lot of things, just like his wife, Nancy Pick. And one of their two children says Lawrence would prefer to any other place having a home right inside Margaret Schöller's bookstore in Charlottenburg. His interest in Germany is older than the new Bundesrepublik and much deeper than the Third Reich. In the beginning of the 80s, as a young student, he had a Fulbright scholarship and maybe his first of many intellectual and real life affairs with the country and its past and present. Referring to the past, Lawrence is one of the best informed persons about trials on war criminals, especially from the Nazi period. His first book, Memory of Judgment, was a milestone. He followed then for months and months international trials set behind the Panzerglas wall in Guantanamo and attended week after week one of the last trials against a war criminal involved in the Holocaust, John Demjanjuk. The book Lawrence wrote about this München trial was called The Right Wrong Man, a title which describes doubts and limits of justice. But what makes Douglas a polymath and what made him ready to deal with Donald Trump? Well, besides traveling to Berlin or teaching with passion and a sense of humor at Amherst College, Lawrence found it not too interesting to have a look at the latest Volvo or, for now, the latest Tesla or play tennis, which then 10 years ago made him start writing novels. The first of them, named The Catastrophist, another, The Vices, was full of what critics called elegant Nabokovian inspiration. As you know, Nabokov as well spent some lifetime in Berlin, and the Russian author was mentioned in Peter Brookes as polymath, maybe only because he passionately collected colorful butterflies, whereas Lawrence collects, besides academic rewards, memories of strange places in Germany. Hitler's retreat in Bavaria, the lost city Küstrin, the German Pompeii an der Oder, or tiny non-murderous places like the Kleingartensiedlung Charlottenburg, where he and we attended the historical match Germany versus Team Argentina during the World Championship. Maybe on that day, he began thinking of a parody of Stieg Larsson's novel, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which was later published under the alias Lars Asserson. All these things didn't seem to fit too perfect in the life of a law professor in one of the famous New England colleges. But destiny had something in mind. When Donald Trump came into office, Douglas started another metamorphosis, not a character, but in his style of publishing. His sharp and regular comments for the British paper The Guardian sounded more like the preliminaries of an attorney general against the president at the brink of crime. To be honest, they were so sophisticated that I didn't understand all of them. Months before the November election, Lawrence Douglas became quite famous as a dark prophet raising the Voldemort question, will he go? His book, which seemed partly fiction, then became a lucid vision of what Trump was planning or thinking of. Not to concede, resist, stay, even with the use of force, which all happened. Culminating in the events of January 6th, by that time, maybe Lawrence had long started to plan his exile in Berlin in case of, but at last, this was not necessary. So this is, besides COVID, one of the reasons why Mr. Douglas is not yet attending his fellowship in Berlin, but in the comfort of his home office. So before you start reading or talking about a passage from your book, here's my first question to you, Lawrence. When did you really get afraid that your academic considerations on Trump could become real American present?
Well, Peter, I'll try to answer that question. Let me first start off with a couple of remarks of my own. My remarks are going to be really quite short because I think there's really kind of nothing more lethal than a long Zoom lecture, and I'm most eager to have kind of an extended conversation with Peter. I'd like to just start off by briefly thanking Caitlin Hahn of the American Academy for pulling this event together. As Daniel and Peter mentioned, I was supposed to be at the American Academy this spring, but had to defer as a result of the pandemic. And I'm very much looking forward to being in residence a year from now, starting in January, at which time I hope to be able to deliver a lecture in person. I'd also, of course, like to extend my great gratitude to Peter Carstens for graciously agreeing to participate in this conversation. I've been an immense fan of Peter's journalism for well over a decade. I am honored to be able to call him a dear friend. In fact, the very first time I visited the American Academy was at Peter's invitation, and I was deeply touched by his introduction. And I'm really looking very much forward to our conversation. I should mention that his mention of my interest in Kestrin or in Nabokov was also fueled by his willingness to, in addition to being an incredibly generous and loyal friend, to be an incredibly aggressive tour guide, bringing me around to the various haunts of Berlin where Nabokov had previously lived, and also taking me out to Kestrin. As Peter mentioned, about a year ago, I published this book called Will He Go? As you can see, it's really a very short book, a very thin book. And I should mention that the book was not in the first instance about Donald Trump. It really began as a thought experiment. And the experiment was kind of based on two premises. And the first premise was that Trump would lose the election of 2020. And I should say that when I began writing, that was hardly a safe assumption. In fact, I think it's always hard to play history by counterfactual, but I think it is fair to say that if it weren't for Trump's epic failure of leadership in response to the COVID pandemic, it's very possible that he would have been reelected. And I suppose this is one of the ironies of his presidency. The fact that what cost him his presidency was not his pattern of dramatically abusing the executive office. He really lost it simply because he failed to respond adequately to a crisis. The second premise behind the book was that Trump would refuse to concede defeat. And this goes back to the question that Peter posed to me at the outset, because in the book, I tried to imagine a scenario. And the scenario that or at least one of the scenarios I played out in the book was that Trump would actually enjoy an election day lead in key swing states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and that he would prematurely declare victory based on that lead. And that what would happen is that in the days following the election, Trump's lead over Biden would vanish as these key swing states counted their mail-in votes. And so that's the kind of scenario I tried to spell out in the book. And I'll just read very briefly from an excerpt from the book. So again, this is the scenario that I was imagining. As Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania continue counting their absentee and provisional ballots, a clear pattern begins to emerge. President Trump's lead over Joe Biden is shrinking, and within days, it vanishes altogether. Biden now leads in all 3 states. If these leads hold up, he, Biden, will enjoy an electoral majority and become our next president. None of this catches President Trump unprepared. Since declaring himself victorious on election day, he has been tweeting tirelessly. These are now the imagined tweets. In interest of fairness, election must be called now. We must stop the corrupt Democrats in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin from stealing our victory with thousands of fake votes. Democrats, will never stop trying to steal an election. They can't win honestly. Must go with election day count. Stories of disgusting fraud pouring in from Michigan. Dems can't win honestly, so they cheat. Courts must put this to a stop. While Trump's claims of fraud lack merit, they find support among his various megaphones in Congress and the media and gain traction with his supporters, who, like millions of other Americans, cannot fathom how tens of thousands of votes can seemingly materialize after Election Day. Trump's tweets and the echo chamber of right-wing social media magnify small acts of incompetence and confusion into a grand organized conspiracy to overturn the results of Election Day. Trump's lawyers, aided by the Justice Department, file suit to strike the provisional ballots in the 3 battleground states. So after the book came out, a number of interviewers, so again, the book came out about a year ago, about half a year before the election. And so after the book came out, a number of interviewers pushed me back on this. They asked me whether I wasn't just indulging in some kind of nightmare fantasy, and wasn't it possible that Trump, after all his bluster, that he might not just graciously admit the defeat once results came in case he lost. And I must say, I actually found the question quite surprising, because to my mind, even though if it weren't clear whether Trump would lose, it was absolutely clear that Trump would never concede loss if he did. Long ago, the great Dutch philosopher Spinoza observed that persons persist in being themselves. And this seemed to be all the more of the case in the case of Donald Trump. Trump, the brand was built on winning, and he would never do anything, I think, to tarnish that brand. But again, these are just the kind of the premises of this thought experiment, which led me to ask the main question of the book, which was how well prepared is the American system of federal and constitutional law equipped to deal with a president who refused to acknowledge electoral defeat. And what I tried to make clear in the body of the book was that our system is not well designed at all to deal with that type of problem. In fact, I tried to point out that given the peculiar way that we go about electing a president, that this method is almost tailor-made for an incumbent prepared to engage in an act of electoral defiance. And in the book, I tried to point out how a sitting president's refusal to acknowledge electoral defeat could actually trigger a genuine crisis of the peaceful transfer of power from which there would be no clear exit. Now, fortunately, I think we can say that the United States managed to avoid the worst case scenario in the recent election. And in some regards, I think we can say that America appears even to have snapped back from the nightmare of Trump's presidency. So far under President Biden's steady, very competent leadership, the days already seem remote when we lived in a mesmerized and appalled anticipation of the next tweet coming from Donald Trump. On the other hand, I think to say that things have snapped back is also too simple. The fact is, and again, this is probably familiar to many of us, majority of members of Congress voted not to certify Biden's victory after Trump's supporters and insurrectionists had stormed the Capitol. That, I suppose, is not a sign of a politically healthy republic. In recent weeks, we've seen Republican state legislatures exploiting the myth of electoral fraud to push through laws designed to limit the vote of persons of color, that is, people who vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. And we know that tens of millions of Americans continue to believe that Trump's victory was stolen from him. Trump remains, as far as we can tell, the king, if not the kingmaker of the Republican Party. Right-wing media outlets and social media platforms continue to loudly blast the messages of would-be demagogues and conspiracy theorists who would, I suppose, be eager to assume the mantle of a Trump 2.0. So while we've managed to avoid a catastrophe in the recent election, I think American politics remains in certain ways in a state of advanced ill health. So maybe on that happy note, Peter, we can continue the conversation. I'm not sure if I adequately answered your preliminary question, but feel free to repose it if I haven't. Back to you, Herr Carstens.
Mr. Doug as well. You said that the American Constitution was not well designed at all for this kind of happening. But how can that be that after 240 years, this turns out, and that over the most of that time, I guess there's only one or two presidents who didn't concede, that it took such a long time to bring that out? And the second question, maybe at once, are you sure that you did not write the script for what Trump and his team then tried? Didn't you bring them on the idea somehow?
You know, it's very funny. I'll start with the second question first, Peter, because there are people who ask me that and ask me whether I worried that I was kind of delivering the template for them. And you know, much as I'd like to indulge the fantasy of being some kind of mad scientist who devised this blueprint for electoral defiance, I think there are people with a much higher pay grade who were capable of connecting the dots in ways similar to the way I did. That is, I think some of the defects with the system were pretty visible, and one didn't need even necessarily to be an expert in American constitutional law to see the vulnerabilities of the system. So I don't necessarily think that I should be indicted as some kind of a co-conspirator in an effort to undermine the integrity of the American electoral process. For the first question about the Constitution, I think it's an excellent question, and you know, I think one of the things that the Trump presidency really reminds us of is the way in which any constitutional democracy has a soft underbelly. And I think the soft underbelly is basically the norms of the system that political leaders have to buy into in order for a system to work. You know, I'm reminded, this goes all the way back from when I was in college, and I remember reading Emil Durkheim's work on contract. And one of the things that Durkheim you know, observed is there always have to be some non-contractual basis of contract. For a system of contract to work, it can't only rely on threats and litigation. There has to be some kind of normative buy-in. And I think it's similar with any kind of system of constitutional democracy. And I think the shocking thing about Trump and his presidency were maybe two separate points. Is one, the way in which he succeeded in being elected, despite his normative rejection of real basic principles of the system. And secondly, the way in which he really did not have to pay a deep political price for that refusal to buy into the norms of the system. Now we can talk about whether he paid a political price ultimately, and he remains the only president in American history to have the dubious distinction of being twice impeached, though again, never removed from office. But again, there was that absence of normative buy-in, and I think he really kind of revealed something about our constitutional system, that it really can't protect itself. It has to kind of presuppose that people have bought into the underlying assumptions and axioms of the system. That said, the system does have particular vulnerabilities with regards to the way we elect the president. That system is deeply flawed, and I think in many respects, we've just been lucky in our history that those flaws haven't led to a real, crisis of a transfer of power.
On the other hand, Trump's defeat or the failure to reverse the result never stopped after the second night after the election. So wherever his lawyers appeared, they lost. Giuliani went to every place wherever you could think of, even garden centers, to present his allegations, but they didn't win only one. So until the 6th of January, it's an image of a total decline and total failure, which possibly makes me think that your constitution, the American Constitution, is strong, because whatever Trump did until the use of force, he failed. And every court resisted to his allegations, sometimes even with ironic and also very sad comments on what Trump and Trump's team did. Isn't that true as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, exactly, you point out. I mean, I think there were 61 lawsuits that were brought in various states, and he lost 60 of the 61. And the one that he won was really kind of a trivial outcome. It had no bearing whatsoever on the election, and he lost before judges that he himself had appointed. Mm-hmm. So, there was a fear that there would be loyalists installed in the federal judiciary who would find in ways supportive of him. And that turned out not to be the case. So he lost before his own judges. He lost before the Supreme Court that, had 3 of his appointees presently on the 9-member US Supreme Court. And I would say that if there was one thing that really provided some solace in this whole process of electoral defiance, it's, as you suggest, Petra, it's the American court system. The American court system functioned very well. There are some other examples of political actors functioning well also. Some on the state level. On the state level, they really pushed back against the allegations of fraud and the conspiracy theories that Trump was circulating. And again, these local officials also included Republican officials. On the other hand, I'm not sure if it was simply the events of January 6th that exposed some of the dangers posed by his act of electoral defiance. I mean, even before January 6th, we saw Republicans on the national level, not so much on the local level, but really on the national level, buying in to this conspiracy theory, and basically into his lies, into the lie that what had cost him electoral defeat was this systematic pattern of electoral fraud in multiple states. And that, I think, is very, very disturbing. The fact that you have people who really take an oath to uphold the Constitution, that is, these members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And, this goes back to something I mentioned in my brief opening remarks, that you have after the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, you still have a substantial majority of members of Congress, Republican members, voting not to certify or refusing to certify Biden's victory. And that was, shocking. And, I'm no fan of Mitch McConnell, but probably you and many of the observers had an opportunity to see, to hear McConnell's speech on January 6th, which was really quite moving. It was really quite moving, saying, when he gets up there and he says, and he made the speech before the storming of the Capitol, he said, by refusing to certify this victory, what are we doing here? We are doing permanent damage to this nation. And so, I think you're absolutely right, Peter, that in a certain sense, the strength of the system did prevail, but some pretty profound weaknesses were exposed. And the last thing I'll mention about that is, I think we can also really count ourselves lucky that the margins of victory, even though they were narrow in the swing states, weren't that narrow. That is, if you go back to something like Florida in the year 2000, where
Bush.
Exactly, in the Bush-Gore, when George W. Bush wins the US presidency by beating Al Gore in Florida by 537 votes. If you had anything like that, that would have been a nightmare scenario, because I really do think then the allegations of fraud could really have gained traction. So I think we did, in a certain sense, the margin of victory for Biden made it harder for Trump's allegations to really kind of gain traction.
We have to distinguish, I guess, between the people in the Republican Party who still have problems with acknowledging reality. But that's a personal, individual thing. There are quite a lot of individuals, but referring to the Constitution, you said it's not very well designed. But where exactly is the design thoughtful? The only thing that when we were observing the whole process, we were deeply astonished how long it can take. So all these regional, local, state confirmations, the very long process of the Electoral College, things like that. We never knew that it could take so long until you would get a real result. That would totally be different in Germany or in many other democracies. So the length of the process, that's astonishing. But is this the mistake in the Constitution, or where would you have to correct the Constitution to make it safer for a process like that?
Well, I think one of the biggest, there are obviously ways in which our Constitution is a remarkable document, and obviously this is a document that was drafted in, a steamy summer in Philadelphia in 1787. Now, of course, it's been amended a few times over the centuries, but this is an old document, and for all its greatness, there are some real problems with the American Constitution. And one of the most dramatic of those problems is the way we elect a president through the Electoral College. And one of the reasons it took so long for us to have the results in this most recent election, it wasn't simply that you have to count mail-in ballots. It was the fact that it's really not the people of the United States who elect the president. It's the people within states. And again, this is part of this, what I would say is a really flawed design for electing a president. So, we knew very quickly that Joe Biden had captured the national popular vote in the United States. But the national popular vote is not dispositive for an election in the United States. In fact, we know that a candidate can lose the popular vote and still win the Electoral College vote. And I could certainly very quickly give a thumbnail sketch as to how that can happen if the audience is interested in that. But the fact remains that the fact that Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden by 7 million votes, that's a substantial defeat. That's a substantial defeat in terms of the national popular vote. But if 44,000 votes, just 44,000 votes, had switched in the states of Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, we would have had an electoral college tie, which again would have been a nightmare. And again, so suddenly, instead of focusing on this very substantial electoral popular victory, everyone has to focus on what's happening in Georgia. And Georgia, 10,000 votes is a very small margin of victory. It's larger than the 537 that George W. Bush had in Florida in 2000, but still, relatively speaking, for a state with millions of residents, 10,000 is a tiny number. And so that's why it takes so long to get these results. And it puts all the pressure on these swing states. And it's a completely dysfunctional and really arguably dangerous system. And the reason I say dangerous as well is because I think Donald Trump, it's very difficult to make 7 million popular votes disappear. You can't argue away 7 million votes. It's not that hard to argue away 10,000 votes, to get on a phone, as we know President Trump did, call the Secretary of State of Georgia and say, find me 11,000 more votes. Find me the votes that give me Georgia. And yeah, I can go into greater detail about that, but it is a dysfunctional system for electing a president. Now, can I mention one other dysfunctional part of the Constitution? Do you mind?
Yes, of course.
Yes. So the other significantly, dramatically dysfunctional part of our Constitution is the way you amend our Constitution. It's Article 5 of the Constitution. Our Constitution is simply too hard to amend. It's an exceptionally difficult, scholars, a number of scholars have engaged in the project of comparative constitutionalism, have looked at the method of amending other constitutions around the world. And the United States Constitution, depending on which study you look at, ranks either as the single most difficult constitution to amend or the second most difficult constitution to amend. And so as a result of that, you have a system like the Electoral College, which basically everyone recognizes as dysfunctional. The first effort to get rid of the Electoral College dates from 1816, and there have been many, many efforts to get rid of the Electoral College over the centuries. And it's just impossible to do so, given the incredible difficulty of amending our Constitution.
So that's a real threat. I'm going to open the floor now for some of the questions of our audience, and I'm going to read out some of them. I can't read out them all. There are quite a lot of questions. Some are quite long. I try to make them a little shorter. So here's one. Dear Mr. Douglas, how big is, in your opinion, the influence of Fox News, in particular on the disunity within the American society after the election?
I think it's very substantial. I think it's one of the things that it's very interesting to me, why a country like Germany doesn't have a similar type of news outlet. Obviously, there are ways in which the American media landscape is far more balkanized than the media landscape in many other, Western democracies. And even within Fox News, Fox is a channel, and Fox News is the channel. And there's some aspects of Fox News which subscribe to what I might describe as reasonably honest techniques of reportage. There are these other shows on Fox News, these basically these pundit shows, people like Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson, who really do not subscribe to any of the kind of norms of responsible journalism. And they, I think, really do have a dramatically corrosive and toxic effect on the political climate of the United States, because they basically really supply almost a platform for the circulation of conspiracy theories and lies. In certain ways, these shows, such as the Sean Hannity show, you can almost liken it to Russian state media. It provided just a platform for Trump to say whatever he wanted to. And with the difference being that I think certain Russians at least have the skepticism about state-run media that millions of Americans don't necessarily bring to the programs on Fox that they watch. In addition to Fox, though, I think we shouldn't overlook, media companies that are run by, people with good liberal political instincts. You certainly have, the likes of Twitter and Facebook. They also play, a very powerful role in platforming and providing a megaphone for conspiracy theories to take hold and circulate. So it's not simply the right-wing media, it's even these organizations that at least nominally are run by people with progressive or liberal politics.
But wasn't Fox News as well being part of the better outcome of the whole thing? Because as far as I remember, Fox News was quite early in declaring the victory of Joe Biden. Or am I wrong? And many of the people following Fox News maybe then it was much more difficult not to accept the outcome of the elections.
Right. No, that's exactly right. So, for example, Fox News called Arizona for Biden well before the other major media outlets. But that's why I just tried to make a distinction between Fox News. I mean, Fox News, again, it's a channel, and it's also a particular broadcast within that channel. And again, the broadcast, as I said, it does have, there are some people who are very serious journalists. And that's why I tried to distinguish it from these other shows, like the Sean Hannity show and the Tucker Carlson. And if you watch those shows, I mean, what's remarkable is you basically have, Sean Hannity on the same network repudiating what the news channel is reporting. Saying like, who are these people? Why are they announcing that Arizona has, what's their agenda there? What's going on there that they're announcing Arizona for Biden? Where's the evidence? So again, even within the universe of Fox News, there is a fracture between, some of these people like Chris Wallace, who's a very impressive journalist, and, these people like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson.
Many of our audience are asking a question which I will typically read out from one of them. From my point of view, Trump has attempted a kind of coup d'etat with his organized attacks on the electoral system and the vote counts. Is that how you see it too? And is that how it is seen in the US? Is it not criminally relevant? And are there efforts to hold Trump criminally accountable for it? This is a question that 3, 4, or 5 people have in different versions. So should Trump be sued criminally for what he did? So or is there something going on like that?
Right. So first, the question of whether it's accurate to describe this as a coup d'etat. And in certain respects, I do think it's accurate. The only thing that I would shy away from using the language of coup d'etat is that very often the term coup d'etat is associated with some kind of military intervention. And I think one of the interesting things about Trump's presidency is the way in which organizations that typically support authoritarian strongmen, the intelligence community, the military, those organizations all despise Trump. And I think they didn't believe that he was actually fit to be president of the United States. So he had very, very little support within the FBI, within the NSA, within the CIA, and within the military itself. Maybe a better term is to go to the German and to use the term putsch, because putsch almost kind of captures this, this absence of organization, this kind of violent and yet a disorganized attempt to interfere or overturn the normal processes of governance. Then with respect to the question of could he be held criminally accountable for that action? As a legal matter, he certainly could be. I mean, now that he is no longer a sitting president, he could certainly be indicted on the charges, for example, of inciting an insurrection. I'm not sure if he, and now I'll try to answer the question both predictively and normatively. And so predictively, will he be indicted for inciting an insurrection? I'm not sure he will be, because I think prosecutors recognize that it would be, in my mind, I would agree with this, worse to indict him and then to have him acquitted than not to indict him in the first place. And so I'm not sure if the quantum of evidence is necessarily sufficient in order to indict him for inciting an insurrection. And as a normative matter, I probably also think that I'm just not sure if that's the right way to go, to kind of bring criminal charges against him for what happened on January 6th. I do wish deeply that he had been convicted in his impeachment trial, which of course would have barred him from seeking office again, and which would also have carried the symbolic weight of Trump now being the very first person ever to be impeached and convicted in American history. We should also bear in mind that, like Germany, the United States has we have a federated system, and the federated system almost has dual sovereignties between the state and the federal government with regards to criminal prosecution. And he's also potentially facing state criminal charges arising from fraudulent business practices from the time before he assumed the presidency. And that remains an ongoing investigation. And there, I would not be surprised to see him indicted.
A very short question, asked longer or shorter ways, but the shortest form is, will he come back?
I think he will certainly threaten to come back. I think he will, I think this is someone who craves attention. And we've already seen the ways in which various members of the Republican Party have continued to pay service to him, to kind of make their pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago for the purposes of trying to, kiss the ring of the president in exile, to their mind. So I think it is certainly the case that he will dangle the possibility of running in 2024. I think one of the things that will have the consequence of doing is kind of freezing the field for other Republicans. And we've already seen that there are numbers of Republicans who are already racing to assume the mantle of Donald Trump. So I imagine that he'll either try to, in a sense, kind of remain the candidate, or be the person who will be responsible for designated his hand-chosen successor, because he wants to remain a figure of power and a figure in the public eye.
a question I was asking myself is, what will happen to the Republican Party? I mean, you describe them as a sort of party under the rule of Trump, still kissing his ring and things like that, and all the things they did after the election did not give the impression of a very reasonable party, but a party still following their leader beyond the end. So what is the future of the Republican Party? And part of that, what's the future of the American system if one party of the two-party system is going to be dysfunctional?
Well, the question about the future of the Republican Party is an excellent question. I mean, it's sort of like the big question of the day. You know, many people are now predicting the dissolution of the Republican Party, or at least its fracturing into the party that remains faithful to Donald Trump, and that really has almost kind of turned into a cult of personality. I mean, the one thing that his execrable son, Don Jr., said when he addressed the crowd on January 6th, he said, what are you talking about, the Republican Party? My father is the Republican Party now. And in certain regards, he was accurate. He was true when, you know, that was an accurate statement that he made on January 6th. Obviously, there are other members of the Republican Party who would love to see Donald Trump go away. I mean, people like Mitch McConnell, who, again, sort of made his little Faustian bargain with Trump, for 4 years, got a number of, got a tax break and got many conservative members appointed to the federal judiciary in return for a willingness to support Trump. And again, if I think it tells us something about the state of the Republican Party if Mitch McConnell now is the moral conscience of that party. I mean, that's already telling us something pretty remarkable. The other, you know, side of that party are the people like the Josh Hawleys and the Ted Cruzes, who really are, you know, trying to appeal very much to Trump's base. Now, it is certainly the case that in American history, dominant parties have fractured, and out of that fracture, new parties have emerged. You know, the Republican Party at some point used to have what we might describe as some, you know, reasonably coherent ideology. Whether we embrace that ideology or not, we could, you know, safely predict how the Republican Party would respond to certain key issues. The Republican Party, in the wake of Trump, really has no ideology at all. And so that remains to be seen whether there will be people who will try to revive that ideology. And it is also remarkable just to, you know, in terms of the fracturing of the Republican Party, you know, recall that the single most alienated figure within the Republican Party today is Mitt Romney, the senator from Utah. He's a completely isolated figure within the Republican Party. In 2012, he was the Republican Party. You know, he was the standard bearer of the Republican Party. He was their nominee, and it just kind of it's remarkable to reflect on, you know, the incredible disintegration of the Republican Party in, you know, 8 years or so, from the time of Romney through Trump. So, you know, I think I've sort of dodged your question because I think it is very difficult to predict. I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen, whether Trump is going to be able to hold the Republican Party together, or there will be sufficient dissatisfaction that we'll see people kind of break off and start some other party.
There's one question referring to the way of voting. It asked if there should be one national voting. This is one question. And another one is, how come that Georgia now can so easily change its voting law?
Right. Well, again, it's one of these things that question is sort of goes back to some of the flaws in constitutional design. So there's a little piece of constitutional text that reads that the time, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed by each state legislature thereof. That's the little language in the Constitution. So it gives, and again, Congress can actually step in if they choose to, but basically we have a very decentralized electoral system. And that decentralized system is in many ways built into the Constitution itself. And so it is the case that, as I mentioned, that Congress could step in and try to take steps to federalize that system. And in fact, there is a law right now, or a piece of legislation right now, which is attempting to do exactly that. And that piece of legislation has already passed the House of Representatives, but at present, it has no chance to pass the Senate. And, I don't want to heap criticism on our great Constitution, but another one of, I would say, the defects in the design of our Constitution is the Senate itself. The Senate, as many of you probably know, gives 2 senators to every state, regardless of population. And what that does is it just so happens that there are many small white agricultural states which are the incredible beneficiary of this system, which makes the Senate a far more conservative chamber than is the United States as a whole. So, for example, Wyoming, with its population of 500,000, has exactly the same, senatorial representation as California, with its population of 40 million. And again, that gives an incredible amount of power to white, rural, small states that are able to frustrate and to create a minority veto to all sorts of progressive legislation. And again, this progressive legislation seeks to federalize election law. So we could hope it passes, but there's no likelihood that it actually will because of the minority veto that's built into the structure of the Senate.
Thank you. There's one question referring the Republican Party or changes that will or may take place in the party system in the United States. The question is, will there be a new party in the United States, a sort of patriotic Trump party?
It remains to be seen if the Republican Party splits. It's possible that the split could happen in 2 separate ways. One way is that the Republican Party now becomes the Trump party. So it's not that the Trump split from the Republican Party. It's people like Mitt Romney and maybe even Mitch McConnell or something who are sick of the Trumpian politics and the politics of personality, a cult of personality, that they're the ones who break off. So it is the case that Trump is so dominant within the Republican Party today that it probably is more likely to see what we might say is more moderate, or let's say more ideologically coherent Republicans breaking off from the Republicans than the other way around. That is, the Trumpians breaking off from the Republicans. And again, that just reminds us that the degree to which Trump has been able to take over this party.
Was it critical to the outcome, especially around 6th of January, that nearly all security columns in the United States, the FBI, the police, you mentioned it already, no, not the police, but the FBI and the Army, people like that, National Guards, were on the side of, let's say, democracy.
Yeah.
Was this a critical point in the outcome, or was it not going that far, that it was necessary for, let's say, for the military to to declare that they are loyal to the Constitution and not to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I don't think things ever got that far on January 6th. That is, as dramatic as the images were and as shocking as the images were. You know, for me, watching it, the only similar level of shock I've ever had was actually on 9/11, at least, you know, from witnessing something domestically. Obviously, you know, I don't want to compare the two events exactly, but I don't think at any point on January 6th, our democracy was held in the balance as we waited to see whether the military would declare its alliance for Trump or for Biden. That moment, that we were never close to that, I believe. And I'm not sure if, and I think one of the reasons we were never close to that is it's even within Congress. I mean, there was very little support going on for the insurrectionists. Now, there was an immediate attempt to spin what was happening and to then, you know, kind of engage in these so-called false flag maneuvers and to blame the insurrectionists as not supporters of Donald Trump, but as members of Antifa. But it's not as if there was ever any kind of, you know, larger welling of support for them. And yeah, I don't think we were really in any mortal threat of seeing our democracy disintegrate on January 6th. And the larger point that I guess that I made earlier is it is interesting to see the way in which an authoritarian such as Trump never enjoyed the support of the kinds of organizations that one typically sees an authoritarian anchoring their power in.
In the short time between 6th of January and the end of Donald Trump's term, he was tried to be impeached for the second time. Can you specifically talk a little bit about this impeachment mechanism, and did it work or fail at that point?
I guess in whether it worked or failed, we can use the great German expression of Jein, of kind of yes and no. The original Constitution basically contemplated two methods for getting rid of a president. One method is through the ballot on elections that take place every 4 years. I should note that we really don't have any mechanism within our Constitution for calling early elections. We don't really have any mechanism like that. And the other mechanism that the framers of the Constitution created was the impeachment process. And the impeachment process really was designed as an extraordinary maneuver to remove someone who had abused the office. The language in the Constitution, the kind of the legal language that's used is a person can be removed from office for that is present for high crimes and misdemeanors. And there's been a lot of debate about the meaning of that language. That is, whether it is the case that the president actually would have had to engage in genuine criminal conduct in order to satisfy that high crimes and misdemeanor standard, or whether simply a significant abuse of office satisfies it, even if that abuse of office doesn't rise to the level of crime. Historically, I think it's very clear, if you look at the historical materials, that that the meaning of the term was really meant to punish abuses of office, and that language did not refer to crime in the conventional legal sense of the term. In any case, he was impeached for a second time. That is, the process of impeachment is sort of a misleading term because it really is a two-step process. The first step is impeachment, and that is a step that's undertaken by the House of Representatives. And that is, if you were trying to draw an analogy to a criminal trial, that would be, in a sense, an indictment. And so by voting to impeach, the House is basically sending what we can describe as kind of an article of indictment over to the Senate. The Senate then has the responsibility of kind of conducting a trial, and the trial conviction in that trial has to be by supermajority. That is, you would need to have at least 2/3 of senators voting to convict. So in this most recent and the second impeachment proceeding, he was again, the articles of impeachment were voted by a majority of the House. And then, of course, he escaped conviction by the Senate. If you had to ask yourself, again, the question of, did this process succeed or fail? I suppose you can say it succeeded in the sense that Trump does have this, as I mentioned, dubious distinction of being the only president in history to twice face this extraordinary form of rebuke. And it is an extraordinary form of rebuke. On the other hand, you can also turn it around and say, well, he's also the only person to have survived this impeachment proceeding twice.
That's how he would put it, right?
Yes, that's of course how he would put it. And you saw the ways in which members of the Senate tried to justify their acts of acquittal. None of them really got up there and said, hey, what he did on January 6th was swell. That was fine. No one said that. I think the typical response was Mitch McConnell's response, which was, he's already out of office, so how can we remove him from office? Mm-hmm. Again, a very misleading kind of answer, because the impeachment mechanisms does more than just remove someone. It also contemplates a second sanction, which is to bar them from future office. So, in my mind, did the impeachment proceeding succeed? No, it didn't. Though again, it might also, my hope is that it actually damaged the political reputation of those Republican senators who really kind of created an excuse to avoid voting to convict.
Another question, just connecting to that. You mentioned that Trump did not pay a political price for rejecting the norms of American democracy. To what extent do you believe this represents a large fraction of American citizens themselves rejecting those norms?
That's actually a very good question. There have been polls, conducted on that, and yeah, some of the results of those polls are also pretty disturbing. I mean, there was a poll, I think it was taken in, I described the poll in the book, which was taken sometime during Trump's presidency. I believe it was either 2017 or 2018, and it was of Republicans who had voted for Trump, so not just Republican, but Republican voters, I believe. And some of the results of that poll were pretty disturbing. Things like, would you support a delay in the election if the president called for one? Now, one thing we should notice about the American federal law is the president can't do that anyway, so we don't really have to worry about that. Congress is the only institution that could actually delay an election. They set the date of the election. And but I think it was close to half the respondents, the Republican respondents, said they would support that. There was I thought an even more shocking result where I think like 25% of the respondents said they would support having the president shut down news organizations such as the Washington Post and the New York Times, and no doubt the FOZ had been included in the question. And I remember reading a description of the poll. The people who were writing about the poll said, well, fortunately, only 1/4 of Republicans would support the shutting down of these newspapers. And I was like, only 1/4. That is supposed to be something from which we receive comfort. That struck me as a pretty disturbingly high percentage of people willing to sacrifice one of the most basic rights guaranteed by our Constitution.
One question, maybe one of the last ones. What would have happened if Georgia's Secretary of State, Raffensperger, had done what Trump asked him to do? What could the Democrats have done to prevent the certification of Trump in Georgia, which obviously would have gone against the will of the people in that state?
Well, remember what Trump was asking. He was asking Raffensperger to find, about 12,000 votes that would overcome his margin of defeat. Had Raffensperger claimed to do so, or had he claimed that we now have, let's say, evidence that that we were wrong, that Trump is correct, that the margin that we have, let's make up the number, 20,000 votes for Biden that we believe had been improperly counted. They were the result of some systematic fraud. Had he made that determination, that obviously would have immediately led to litigation. So we would have been right back in the courts. And the courts ultimately would have been thrust in the position of reviewing that determination that the original certification by the state was erroneous. And presumably that would have, we could have had another one of these things that go up to the US Supreme Court. Now, had it gone to the US Supreme Court, how would the court have responded? Again, I think, as we spoke about earlier, Pedro, I think one of the nice takeaways from this whole traumatic episode was the bulwark against these type of acts of electoral defiance that the courts were able to erect. So even a Supreme Court, which is as conservative as our present Supreme Court, which is undoubtedly most conservative Supreme Court the United States has had since at least before 1937. So you really have to go back decades and decades to find a similarly conservative Supreme Court. I don't think there's a chance that Trump would have won, that that kind of act would have been upheld by the US Supreme Court.
So who do you think, which institution is the winner of the whole process? I mean, we got many people and parties and institutions that lost. So is it the court system that is the winner of this confrontation between one man and his party and the state?
I would say that there were a couple of, so in addition to the court system, I would also say that let's not ignore the role that media outlets play. I mean, there were many media outlets that played a very responsible role in this, of reminding people that the election had proceeded in a procedurally fair fashion. I think another winner was a lot of these, almost the heroes of this are the election officials, these thousands and thousands of election officials all over the country, both Democrats and Republicans, who did their job, who sat there counting these ballots. And a lot of them, because there were so many mail-in ballots as a result of COVID, it was quite a labor-intensive process. And they did it in a highly responsible fashion. And they did it in faithful execution of their belief in an electoral democracy. And, as I think we said earlier, the big losers, I think, were not simply Donald Trump, but the people like Ted Cruz and the Josh Hawleys and these other national Republican figures who were willing to peddle the conspiracy theories and lies that Trump and other right-wing media were circulating.
I was asking me, after the election, we were a little bit afraid that there would be many demonstrations against the winner or against the election itself or pro-Trump. But there were less demonstrators than we have in Germany nearly every week against the COVID measures. So there were not too many people on the streets all over the United States compared to European standards and maybe even compared to US standards. How do you explain that?
Well, I think one thing is, I don't want to give too much credit to President Biden, but I do think he deserves a certain amount of credit. I mean, he has, bent over backwards to project a message of unity. I hate to say this, but the United States remains a deeply racist country, and I think one of the things that even if it were under the radar, Barack Obama was considered. There was nothing he could do that would not make him into a divisive figure. One of the things with Barack Obama could get up and give a speech in which he would say, people, we need to love each other. We need to love each other. All we need to do is love, love, love. And you would turn on the right-wing media at night and you hear these commentators say, have you ever heard such a hateful, divisive speech in your life? And I don't think they can do that with Joe Biden. They simply cannot get that kind of traction. I don't think these forces of that are deeply alienated with American politics, these white supremacist forces, I don't think they've gone away. So, it's the way these things, they pop up and then they're pushed underground. And the fact that they're pushed a little bit underground, I don't think it means that the threat has disappeared, but at least it is reassuring to see them at least somewhat pushed underground rather than visibly on display on a daily basis.
So this was my last question. Thank you very much. And I think we had a lot of questions from the audience, but for a minute or two, no more. Nearly everyone is still there. Only 2 or 3 left us during the last hour. So I give the word back to Daniel Benjamin for the farewell of the evening. Thank you very much, Lawrence. Hope to see you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you greatly.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lawrence. It was fascinating talk. It was a fascinating conversation. And I'm really grateful to both of you. It reminded me just how much my brain has enjoyed what Bill Clinton used to call the quiet blessings of a normal life for the last few months. I think we've all kind of seen our brain waves change again after the overstimulus that went on for several years and ended up with the inauguration on January 20th. But historians and social scientists of all stripe will be picking over this episode, and we will be wondering about our own future, I think quite intensively, and what lies ahead in the next round of elections, both in the Congress and for the White House for quite some time. So Lawrence, I'm looking forward to your arrival here so we can chew this all over again and again and again, as is our want. And I want to thank you both for a fascinating conversation. Before we close, I just want to preview some upcoming events. For those who are still interested in politics, including international politics and diplomacy, tomorrow we will have the Stephen M. Kellen book talk, which will present 2 great heavyweights on the subject. Robert Zoellick, former head of the World Bank, former Deputy Secretary of State, and a man who served in many, many different capacities in public life, will discuss his new book on the history of US diplomacy and foreign policy. And he will do that with Wolfgang Ischinger, titan of German diplomacy, former ambassador in Washington, former leading figure in the German foreign ministry and well known to all Germans. And next week, we will turn the dial and we will have our Max Beckmann lecture with the renowned artist Sean Scully on Monday the 26th. If you would like to attend any of these events, please do go to our website and sign up for them. And we look forward to having you join us. So again, Lawrence, Petra, thanks so much. It's been a terrific discussion.